Hi, Tick. I'm your mind. Sorry we don't talk much, but I'm easily distracted by shiny objects. The Tick.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses. Today we are talking about a different state of mind than everything else that we've been talking about this month, but this is definitely a mindset that we would love for you to get your head around when writing and developing interesting characters for your story.
We do need to start off and say clearly, we are not experts in, well, anything, really, but certainly not in psychology. We are not here to diagnose anybody, but we are going to be talking about neurodivergence and the various forms people associate with that term.
For the record, I am about as neurospicy as yogurt. I am as boring as it gets. I might be close to sociopath, but not quite, which is not one of the ones we're talking about today. So I am more of a boring baseline.
And I am undiagnosed, but likely some form of ADHD. I am learning that it is running more in my family than I expected.
It's remarkable how often these things are genetic, which we'll talk about later. Our list of neurodivergences that we're talking about comes from the nhs.uk. They have 5 main neurodivergences that we're going to cover, and a lot of our information comes from them. Don't blame them if I mess something up in the notes. But they are a great resource to look into if you want to make one of your characters one of these things.
Another good thing to keep in mind is that most of these are on some form of spectrum where there isn't a defined, if you have this, you are going to experience exactly these things. And especially with something like ADHD and autism, gender can also play a role in how those things present. So it is important to do research into these for your characters and how it will likely present in them, and understand that when you see them on the page, it is not a 100% accurate representation of all X people out there.
Now, the 5 that we are going to cover today are ADHD or ADD,
autism or the autism spectrum conditions,
dyscalculia, which is a number confusion,
dyslexia, which is the more commonly known letter and word confusion,
and dyspraxia, or DCD, developmental coordination disorder, which is a physical space and making your body do what it's supposed to do disorder.
We are going to be talking about the things that mostly won't stop your character from doing the thing, but will influence how they go about it. Somebody with ADHD is going to live in their world and take on major tasks differently than somebody who is neurotypical.
We do want to emphasize that these neurodivergences are not flaws for your character to overcome. They don't necessarily reflect the lie that your character believes about themselves. They don't magically get better in whatever this is. This is a way that the mind functions that is not necessarily normal, instead of a lie that the character has to prove false.
Most importantly, it's not a flaw that needs to be fixed. It is just who they are, and it is good to have that sort of representation in our media. The reason we say this is not a flaw is because when we talk about flaws, we are usually meaning the personal challenges that the character is going to face, that they are forced to grow because of, and they usually leave behind most of the flaw. But you can't leave behind neurodivergence. That is just who you are.
The flaw can be related to whatever the neurodivergence is, but accepting it as part of who they are would be the solution, not getting rid of it. If this character is incredibly magically talented and the entire magic system is written down, but they're dyslexic, then they might think that they are lesser. The dyslexia is affecting the lie and informing the lie, but accepting who they are and how that changes how they use magic, often for the better, is the solution, not getting rid of the dyslexia.
We should also mention here the Barnum-Forer effect. This is something I see people not bringing up in name, but bringing up an idea a lot related to TikTok and in the neurodivergent world of TikTok, where everybody's like, oh, it's just because you see a lot of ADHD people, now you think you have ADHD.
It's very easy to take all of these things that we're about to talk about and go, well, I feel like I have some of that. It's not super common for people to have all 5 of these. So as we're listening, make sure you emotionally evaluate before connecting with all of these symptoms that we're talking about.
And especially with things like ADHD and the autism, there are some things on this list that neurotypical people do as well. It is just more frequent among people who are neurodivergent.
The first one we're going to talk about today is ADHD or ADD, which are not exactly the same, but they go hand in hand quite a bit.
ADD, I believe, as a term is starting to phase itself out, but I'm not entirely sure on that. Again, not a psychology expert here. Some of the symptoms associated with ADHD can be fun to write. It can give you a fun, spicy character to put on page. Some of the common symptoms include appearing forgetful or losing a lot of things. ADHD people have a problem with object permanence. If they can't see it, it does not exist.
I was talking with my brother who is diagnosed ADHD, and he says that he understands why people used to think they were haunted if they were actually ADHD. Because of the object permanence, the dishes don't exist unless the cupboards are open. So he will open all of the cupboards as he's looking for the thing, and then once he found it, he goes on and does the thing. And he doesn't realize that he's left all the cupboards open. So he'll turn around and every cupboard in the kitchen is open, and it feels like he's being haunted because he doesn't remember opening all those cupboards.
And for me, kitchen appliances especially, I forget that I have a KitchenAid because it is hidden away in a cupboard. And I don't think about like, oh, let me use my KitchenAid very often. I have had it for years.
I have an acquaintance who reorganizes her fridge because of the object permanence issue. So all of the vegetables go in the door and all the condiments go in the back of the fridge. Because the condiments, if you're opening the fridge, you know you're aiming for the thing. But if you're just opening the fridge, figuring out what to eat, and the vegetables are over there, they don't exist. If they're right here in the door, they do exist.
Yeah, if the vegetables are in a drawer, nope, they're gone. Non-existent. Doesn't matter if that drawer is see-through, if I cannot see it. If there is a barrier, I cannot see it. And I've talked in our first episode how this object permanence affects things like grief for somebody who is ADHD, where people are also subject to this object permanence issue. And I don't remember that they exist sometimes.
The next symptom that can be fun to talk about is the weird niche hobbies that they can't stick with for a long time, but they hop between and often rotate between the same 7 or 8 things throughout their life, where this month, you know what? I'm going to be all about crocheting armor. And then next month, I'm going to be all about guns and trains or whatever.
You are describing me and my husband, thank you.
Yes, I am.
I have my graveyard of hobbies where for a while I was really focused on sewing costumes, and then I jumped to crocheting, and then I jumped to drawing, and then I jumped to really being focused on video games, and then to writing, and then to chainmail, and then to spraying book edges, and then to more video games and chainmail, and I just rotate through hobbies and I get all of the fun, shiny things to do it. And then that scratches the itch and I move on to the next one.
Another thing to write for your ADHD symptoms is this inability to even think about waiting their turn. There's the thing, I'm going to go do the thing. They're focused and they will often act without thinking through the consequences because that's the thing. Here's how I get to it.
This, I think, is a result a lot of if I don't do the thing I'm thinking about now, I will forget. So I have to do it now. My sister did this a lot with conversations. She was a much more outspoken ADHD than I likely am. I am kind of the real introvert ADHD. She is the extrovert ADHD. So in conversations, and when we were kids, parents would ask, "How was your day?" She would talk, and then they'd turn to me, and I would start. I'd get about 3 words in, and she would interrupt me because whatever I said reminded her of this other thing that she really, really, really needs to say right now, or she's going to forget it. And she interrupted me so often that I stopped talking as a kid. Because why talk when I'm just going to get interrupted all the time? For her, who is likely much stronger in the ADHD scale than me, she really struggles with interrupting everybody's conversations and everybody's sentences, because if she doesn't get it out now, she's going to forget. And in her brain, it is really, 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 really important that it gets out now. Love you, Brie.
I think it's really, really, really important. Kind of sums up how the ADHD brain works. Everything is really, really, really important.
Unless it's not, and that it is not important at all, and it can just go away and not exist.
And I think that goes hand in hand with our next point is these people will often underachieve at work or in education, not because they're unintelligent by any means, but it's just boring.
I disagree with this one.
Okay.
This, I believe, is one of those cases where the gender difference matters. In feminine, female-presenting ADHD, it is far more often to see overachievers. And it will result in burnout because there's a level of anxiety in there of I have to do well, I have to overcompensate for my brain that's not paying attention. And so they end up overachieving in a lot of cases. They do way more than is required. I see a lot of people who don't realize that their 100% is everybody else's like 200%. The other way that it will go is that they will feel like they are underachieving or underworking at work or in school, but they, in reality, are just doing 8 hours of work in about 2 hours because their brain is really focused on it right now and let's do it all in one. And then they feel lazy the rest of the day because now their brain is exhausted. They've done the work, but they've done all of the work.
And a lot of these people who have ADHD, it didn't come about as they became adults. They had it ever since they were a kid. It was often not diagnosed because kids will be kids. Kids have energy. Kids will hop from interest to interest. Kids will super focus on something and then talk a lot about it.
This is another case where gender mattered because most of these studies, especially when our generation were kids, pretty much all of the studies related to ADHD were done on boys. The symptoms of ADHD were the male symptoms of ADHD. So that's why we're seeing a lot of late diagnosed women, because they're starting to understand that ADHD in females presents way differently. Because ADHD in women is more daydreaming rather than the commonly associated hyperactivity where they can't stop moving, girls would disassociate, start daydreaming, and they're off in their own little world somewhere when they get bored and unfocused. And other kind of differences like that, where they've had symptoms since they were a kid, it just wasn't recognized as a common symptom of ADHD until very recently.
ADHD is often diagnosed alongside everything else that we're talking about today. And a couple of other things. We will see it with the OCD, where especially the physical tics of OCD will also pop up in the releasing of energy by doing physical things in ADHD. Those are separate diagnoses, but they do often go hand in hand.
Another one that it's commonly associated with is anxiety, which is also another reason a lot of women went undiagnosed with ADHD because instead they were diagnosed with anxiety.
You will also see it commonly diagnosed with like bipolar disorder or antisocial personality disorder. These are other things that you can look into to reinforce your character if they have ADHD.
For examples of well-written ADHD characters, you can look no further than the Heroes of Olympus series with Percy Jackson. And most of the Half-Bloods, honestly. So many of them are ADHD. And the explanation given is that because of their part god nature, their natural battle reflexes, they're more alert. They need to be on alert more often. So if they don't have something that they're actively fighting, they have those symptoms of ADHD where they are just kind of bouncing and fidgety and very physically ADHD.
The classic example of using ADHD in a comedic effect is the character Doug, the dog in the movie Up, where he's in the middle of a conversation and then he just goes, "Squirrel!" and he gets super excited and his attention is drawn anywhere else.
And one that I like is Sophrena, the Spren in the Stormlight Archive, where she is very curious, very excitable, but easily distracted by anything new and shiny. In one of the books, she admits that she feels like she has two brains, one brain that is rational, that can focus on important things, and then a childlike brain that just jumps and jumps and jumps to the nearest thing that looks shiny.
So when you're writing ADHD, I feel like this one you can use in humor a lot more than the rest of the ones we're talking about, because I don't think ADHD people would see humor as disrespectful. There's a huge association with a "what does this button do?" because there's that childlike brain that wants to go and explore and it's shiny and it's there.
They are often also associated with skittish but cute animals like dogs or squirrels or ferrets. I think the one thing that you would need to be careful with when writing ADHD is to not represent them as lazy. That is a common struggle among people with ADHD, with that executive function disorder, inability to get their brains to do the important tasks, where my house is not dirty because I am lazy. It is dirty because I see the mess and my brain gets overwhelmed and I just can't.
It's funny to me that laziness and hyperactivity are associated, because it seems like those should be opposite in a lot of ways. And it's just that where you're pointing the wind-up toy, I think. The next neurodivergence that we're going to talk about is autism. There is a lot of conversation, especially in the pre-8th grade education system, at least in the US, about autism and how these people think and function. And there were a lot of historical misunderstandings about autism that are now trying to be corrected.
I think of all of the neurodivergence represented in media, autism is one of the most difficult to do appropriately because it's way too easy to stereotype autism. We'll talk about popular examples and some of that a little bit later, but the symptoms, I think, lean themselves, unfortunately, towards being stereotyped. So some of the common symptoms associated with autism and the autism spectrum include their thinking and how differently they think and do problem solving.
They will process and retain a lot of information without a whole lot of prioritizing. These characters are great for writing info dumps and dialogue because that is what autistic people do in person. It's like, here, this is what you need to know about the 4th generation of Magic the Gathering cards, or whatever. They will process and keep vast amounts of information instead of a normal functioning brain will go, this is important to hold on to, this isn't, and we'll be able to forget a lot more.
They also have a different visual or spatial processing. They see spaces and interaction within spaces differently.
The way they interact with people, I think, is where a lot of the stigmatism comes in, where they have to mentally, instead of emotionally, process other people's emotions. So, okay, I am seeing these things, therefore I think you're angry?
This is not because autistic people can't feel emotions. They tend to be very emotional people. However, they have a difficult time interpreting behavior and intention. Because so many other people, especially neurotypicals, lie all the time, people with autism tend to take things at face value. They tend to hear something and take it as, okay, that is the thing, that is the way it is. And if there is a lie anywhere in there, they have a hard time detecting that. And so interpreting behavior and intentions when people commonly try to mask how they're really feeling and how they are really presenting just makes things really difficult for them. Again, not because they can't feel emotion, but because they have a hard time interpreting the signs of emotion in other people.
Hand in hand with that is a smaller friend group. They've got a couple people who get them, and they stick with them for long periods of time. This is where a lot of that differs from ADHD, where they're very mercurial. Autism is you find something and you stick with it. And this is safe. This is a thing that I like. This is information that I have spent a lot of time learning. These are people that I can stick around with, and they can get me and they can help be a comfort object in potentially very overwhelming situations.
They also have a tendency towards compulsive or repetitive behaviors. If they are on the more severe end of the autism spectrum, they will do a lot of physical stimming in very big ways. My nephew will shake his hands and he'll do a physical bouncing to help him calm down. It is a sensory thing that helps whatever emotionally they're experiencing.
They also have trouble adapting to changes in routine. Once they have a routine, things are predictable, they're expected. I don't have to be afraid of it, as compared to if we're deciding we're going to do this other routine in a different order, that can throw them off and that can make them uncomfortable.
They also tend to really dislike small talk, and I get that because small talk is all lying. If you really think about it, small talk is about just lying to each other. And so people with autism tend to really like it when people say what they actually mean. They communicate very straightforward and don't like the hiding what I really feel in a jumble of words.
Hand in hand with that is the inability to tell a convincing lie. It's pretty easy to tell when autistic people are lying depending on what level of autism they have. But the small talk, the lying, the interpreting other people's emotions, all of those being more difficult, tends to mean that they're going to spend more time with just the things that they feel safe and with the routines that make them feel safe. They aren't going to want to experience new things.
That goes along with another common similar diagnosis, which is a high physical sensitivity. People with autism tend to like the same foods because they aren't surprises. They also tend to like highly processed foods because things like fruits have varying textures depending on which bite you're taking, and that is unpleasant.
They will get easily overloaded with especially big situations with a lot of people, with a lot of noise, with a lot of light, and will want to shut down.
When it comes to common diagnoses with autism, it is somewhat common, but not all the time, to be diagnosed along with ADHD, which creates some very interesting things because autism and ADHD sometimes have conflicting symptoms, like the ooh, shiny versus the no, I want to stay in my safe little bubble. As a side note, Asperger's syndrome is no longer really being used as a term. It is just part of the autism spectrum these days. And it is important to note that autism is a very large spectrum. So any one of the symptoms that we've talked about may or may not be present. It may be present extremely or barely at all.
One of the characters out there that is really a big champion for autism, but kind of plays into that autism as a superpower that a lot of that culture is trying to get away from, is Sean Murphy from The Good Doctor. The main character is a doctor who is very intelligent, but he struggles with the bedside manner part of things. He's very good at the diagnosing and the quickly understanding what needs to happen, but people don't generally enjoy working with him. Not because he's like House, where he's just a jerk, but he has trouble communicating with people.
One that is rather unfortunate, one that most people I've seen within the autism community really want people to stop associating with autism because it was so poorly stereotyped, was Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. He is so stereotyped, so plays into some of the more harmful stereotypes of autism that it has done zero favors for people who actually live with autism every day.
One that a lot of the forums seem to like, I haven't actually watched this one myself, but a lot of the forums seem to approve of the 2017 Power Rangers movie, having Billy Cranston as autistic.
I think overall, when you are writing and if you are wanting to represent somebody with autism, it's really not respectful to have the autism as a superpower stereotype or the autism gives them permission to be an insufferable jerk because they're secretly a genius. Those things are not helpful. They're often incorrect. They really tend to play into the lack of emotion felt on the part of the person with autism. They forget that people with autism feel strong emotions even if they can't interpret them.
That goes hand in hand with another thing to just be wary of is just because they have trouble understanding social cues doesn't necessarily make them a sociopath. They, again, feel these things. They can't express them in the same way that neurotypical people do.
And on the flip side, avoid infantilizing autism. Just because they have this disorder does not mean that they are unable to take care of themselves.
I'm seeing some kickbacks on people using high functioning and low functioning for autism. A lot of the culture right now doesn't approve of those particular types of phrases. We don't always have a better way to talk about it, but high functioning just means you're able to mask it a little bit better. As compared to low functioning, it's more obvious. But just because it's visual or not doesn't mean it's happening or not.
I saw one person say that the label of a high-functioning autism is basically you're less of a problem for the rest of us, so good for you. Also, you want to be careful writing anything non-human, like a robot or alien character with these quintessential autism traits, because by doing so, if you are making them very autism-coded, you are telling the entire autism community that they are alien or robotic. And that is, I'm sure, not what you want to do.
Something that you might consider instead, we don't see a lot of these characters having romantic relationships. So if you're writing this character, consider having romance as part of their lives. Because they're often seen as the side character that someone has to deal with, instead of someone living their own lives and being their own person, just thinking differently.
One kind of fun aspect that you can play with your character is their hyperfixation special interest that they latch onto. It's a common thing among the train-loving community that not all autism people are trained people, but all trained people are autistic people. So things like that, very mechanical things, tend to be a good outlet for a lot of people with autism, where they can see it, they know how it works, and they get interested in these very logical processes that make sense to their brains.
Again, this is a great character to have info dump on whatever their hyperfixation is. If you are trying to explain the nuances in how druidic magic works, having that be the one thing that is the safe place for your autistic character can make it a lot of fun when you want to word vomit a whole bunch of stuff that maybe the characters aren't paying attention to and they need time to process, but this character is super excited about.
You can also use this character very well to describe the world if you need the world to feel very large and very chaotic. You can give them an opportunity to be overloaded, have a sensory overload moment, and allow that character to describe how it is living in this world that is just so often overwhelming. It's a very useful tool.
Now, the last three that we're talking about are variations on a theme. That's dyscalculia, which is where they struggle with numbers, dyslexia, where they struggle saying words, and dyspraxia, where they have difficulty with coordination.
With dyscalculia, the symptoms show up when they are dealing with math, with numbers. They find it difficult to do mathematical equations or to retain numerical information.
This goes with especially really large numbers. They just have trouble wrapping their head around. There is a fairly clear difference between 1 and 2. but the number billion and the number a trillion are exactly the same number.
They're big and unobtainable. Yay! Counting change can also be difficult. Calculating tips, any of this kind of quick needing to do a thing in the moment can be a difficult task for somebody who has difficult time retaining number information.
Because of that, there's often a lack of confidence. They're going to not even try with the whole numbers thing. I'm just going to turn the receipt around, shove it to you, and you can do the math for the tip.
I've done that so many times.
Are you all of these?
So far, yes.
Bottom 4.
There's also going to be a lack of confidence with numbers. This can be conditioned, more nurture than nature, as a byproduct of the rest of it. If they have struggled in the past with numbers and figuring out calculations, anything like that, they will be less confident because they know they've been bad in the past.
Another thing to really keep in mind for how your character learns things is they have to physically do them. The interaction with a space, with a thing, makes a lot more sense to this particular type of person than being talked through all the theory. I like to have all of the information at once and then be able to apply it as needed and learn that way. These people need to experience a small part of it and then experience a little more and experience a little more. That is how they understand the world. The theoretical and then applying doesn't make any sense.
They will also find it difficult to either give or follow directions, but they can walk with someone to the right place.
This happens when they are traveling. If they say, hey, you're going to want to go to the mall, and then I need to be there in order to remember if it's left or right.
When it comes to dyscalculia, it doesn't always apply to just numbers. Because numbers are a often theoretical thing, not a physical thing, this translates to other things that are theoretical rather than a physical thing. So they don't work in the space of theory alone, which can apply to physical space like giving directions, following directions to a physical place. But they can walk with them to get there.
A lot of these types of people will develop their own way of doing things. They won't necessarily be any faster or more efficient or whatever. It's just a different path. All roads end up leading to Rome. It might not be the path that I was trained to use, but it doesn't mean it's a wrong path.
I think with the dyscalculia as well, sensing space, sensing distance, sensing speed is all very difficult because, again, that is a very theoretical number thing. Trying to judge how fast a car is going can be difficult because some of that is a subconscious mental calculation that people with dyscalculia struggle with.
It is commonly diagnosed with dyslexia, where if the numbers don't make sense on the receipt, then the words also struggle. The letters are out of order and the numbers being out of order is part of the difficulty of having dyscalculia. So it does happen with dyslexia fairly frequently.
We don't see a lot of characters currently in the world that have an actual dyscalculia because generally it's represented as somebody simply being bad at math.
There is a character in a web series called Worm. The character's name is Kidwin, who has ADD and dyscalculia. And so that is praised in the community as a good example of what this looks like.
And I'm not familiar with this one, but our research also says Jedio from 9 Fox Gambit. If you are familiar with that one and I butchered it, I apologize.
So when you're writing these characters, there are a few things that we want you to take to heart and remember. That they tend to be very creative and very artistic because they're good at the physical arts, because they are physically experiencing the thing as compared to this abstract concept.
If they don't also experience dyslexia, people with dyscalculia tend to have a love of words. They tend to be really great with spelling and grammar because that is something that they comprehend versus the math thing.
People who have this say that they're often seen as very approachable people. And a lot of people come to them for advice and to walk with them through whatever it is that they're going through. It's like, hey, I'm lost. I need someone to guide me here. I will walk with you to the thing.
Some people that we've seen that describe what it is to have dyscalculia, when they think about mental math, it's like trying to remember a dream after you've woken up. It just kind of slips away the more you try to understand, the more you try to remember what all of these calculations are.
They will also have a whole lot of coping mechanisms. They'll be writing down locker combinations instead of memorizing them. Because numbers, especially random numbers that aren't associated with anything that have to be in a specific order, can be very difficult to retain.
They can also struggle to give units of measurement to anything. Like, I don't know how tall he was, but he was kind of a head taller than this person. But they have no idea that that is 6 feet tall.
A lot of this struggle with this one is how other people interact with them, because they'll go, you weren't paying attention. I just told you how to get somewhere, when it's a difficulty tracking without actually doing.
I wonder if there is a tendency among people with this to be really good tippers because they overcompensate for not really understanding how much should be 20% or 18% or 15% or whatever the standard is.
Yeah, a lot of the people I know that are bad at math, I don't know if they are officially dyscalculia, but they just sort of go, this sounds like a good amount, and just put that down. So they will overestimate instead of underestimate if they're trying to give this more or less random guess.
Now let's talk about dyslexia. I think the far more commonly known and understood struggle with words. Some of the symptoms for dyslexia include spelling or reading words incorrectly, not being able to identify when something has been autocorrected to a different word.
I think there's a bit of a love-hate relationship with autocorrect, because if it's the I and E thing, whichever is first, the machine can figure it out. But if it throws in completely the wrong word instead, then it's easy to miss.
Like big witch instead of bog witch.
They also tend to struggle with the right words to express themselves. Putting things into words versus doing them can make things more difficult. There's a lack of confidence with words in general that I am again going to apply more to nurture than to nature, where they don't want to use any words because they're afraid of being wrong, because they were told from a very young age that you are bad at words.
They can also find that reading either black words on white or white on black can be difficult, so having color themes or overlays or anything that visually helps them separate words and letters can assist them in reading better than what they would normally experience.
They also tend to have really bad handwriting. Again, I feel like there's something for everyone in each of these, something that we can relate to. Having the bad handwriting can be a coping mechanism for, I don't know if it's an I or an E, so I'm going to put the dot right in between and hope that they figure it out.
When it comes to dyslexia, it is commonly, like we mentioned in the last one, diagnosed with dyscalculia and also dysgraphia.
I feel like there are a lot more characters in the world that have dyslexia than dyscalculia. One that comes to mind that I really like how they portrayed it is Jaime Lannister in the Game of Thrones series. He describes letters as dancing as he's trying to read them, so he just struggles reading them. He's normally very eloquent in front of the king and doing this and that. If he's reading something out loud, he has to slow down and sound out each syllable in an almost childlike way. For someone who is a very powerful, not to be messed with character in the series, this is an interesting way to portray the character.
Sometimes you can have a character that is dyslexic, but it doesn't have a lot of plot relevance. An example of this kind of representation would be from the Doctor Who episode The Hungry Earth with the character Elliot Northover, where he has dyslexia, but it doesn't actually impact the story.
There is some controversy of if Lois Lane from the Superman comics, if she has dyslexia. Clark Kent spends a fair amount of time proofreading her stuff, and this might just be an expression of affection between two journalists. Or it might be he's protecting her and making sure that things are right, with her tendency to misspell things.
Another example I'm familiar with is in The Six of Crows, character Wylan. I haven't read the second one, so I'm not sure. It's suggested that he has dyslexia because despite having a very good education and a lot of opportunity, he is unable to read, but he has no trouble with math and music and science.
People on the forums really enjoyed the portrayal of dyslexia from writer Lynn in the TV series Glee. He has a phonic dyslexia.
When you are writing a character with dyslexia, something to keep in mind is that it is not as prevalent in other countries, and specifically with other languages. If you look at things like Korean, Spanish, and Italian, their writing systems have a regular correspondence between sound and spelling, where French and English isn't always the case. So the phonics make it easier to learn and cite words, and studies have shown that there's less dyslexia among speakers of languages where there are regular, consistent spellings and rules around that.
This is yet another example of English being a terrible language. Something else to keep in mind is it's often genetic. So if one of your characters has dyslexia, you can often see that with their family line, someone else, and they will pass on coping mechanisms.
A really important note here is that people with dyslexia are not functionally illiterate. They just often need a little bit more time, or perhaps a different font. There have been studies that show some fonts are more friendly to dyslexia than others. Sans serif, far more dyslexia friendly. There are even specifically weighted fonts created for people with dyslexia.
The people with dyslexia also tend to be very good at masking it. They will either have people around them who will help them cope in subtle ways, or just pick the right kind of font for their phone or whatever. They will find ways of coping with it in order to not rock the boat with the rest of the world.
And the final one we're going to talk about today is dyspraxia, or developmental coordination disorder. This is the difficult moving your body in a physical space, neurodivergence.
The key symptom for this is a lack of coordination, which seems fairly obvious by the title. But they also don't have much balance, and they aren't confident in their movement. They aren't likely going to be dancers.
Another thing is that they can have a difficult time with physical things such as typing or writing and drawing or grasping small objects, because it is that coordination, especially these things, are a very small muscle group coordination.
So using chopsticks or a no-go, doing their own hair can be very difficult, even just putting their hair in a ponytail. Muscle memory can also be difficult if it's one of those little smaller things like typing. And sequencing can be a more difficult thing to do, where it's this, then this, then this, on a very nuanced level. That can be a difficult thing for them to go through. In marching band, we had this thing called stacking commands, where the drum major would call out 5 or 6 different things: left haste, right haste, about haste, right haste, left haste. They would call this out, and then on the first whistle tweet, you do the first one, second whistle tweet, you do the second, and then you go through this list as best as your memory will allow. People with dyspraxia have a very difficult time with that kind of a sequence.
They may also experience difficulty with driving. Again, that is a very coordination-reliant thing, because not only are you moving yourself, but you are trying to move an object in ridiculous speeds.
Imagine having to look at the turn signal every time you have to use it, or look down at the gear shift before moving into second gear, third gear, if you're on a stick shift. Not just being able to recognize my hand was there and I pulled my hand away, I can put it back. There is a disconnect there with dyspraxia.
Dyspraxia is commonly diagnosed in people who were born prematurely. I think there's probably an association there with their body was not fully developed yet and ready to get outside the mother's womb when suddenly they had to live and function in their own space.
There will often be a depression and anxiety because they aren't able to do things that they feel like they should be able to do. Chopsticks aren't supposed to be difficult. Pencils are something that children are supposed to be able to use. I, as an adult, struggle using a pencil. Therefore, there is a depression and anxiety with that.
And it can be commonly diagnosed with every other neurodivergence that we have talked about today.
There are a handful of characters with this. Not all of them have that name because it didn't always exist. But Helen Burns from Jane Eyre is often said to have dyspraxia.
Some people believe that possibly Bella Swan from Twilight had it based on some of her symptoms, though I lean more towards she was just clumsy. That classic YA, oh no, I'm clumsy sort of thing.
Some people will also say Tonks from Harry Potter could possibly have had it. Again, isn't written down that she has it.
And one that we've seen listed as a good example is Jojo Rabbit from that titled movie.
So when you're writing these characters, remember that clumsy is not a character flaw. That's not something that your character can just get over. It's really annoying to see this character who is no longer clumsy. Yay!
Oh no, I learned how to fight, so I'm not clumsy. Somebody with dyspraxia, somebody with this, is going to really struggle learning how to do physical fights. And I also want to draw a border here. Just because they're clumsy does not mean they have dyspraxia.
And although it is very much a physical struggle, it can be very emotionally draining as well. So when you're writing these kinds of characters who are struggling with something physical, connecting it emotionally is what makes it powerful to the reader, because the reader is not going to see this physical interaction.
These characters also have a good tendency towards being daydreamers and unable to focus, which makes sense to me. If they have a difficult time moving physically within the world, they are going to withdraw a little bit more into their minds and create a world for themselves in their heads.
A lot of people who have this say they have a weird relationship with physical humor as well. They're watching the Three Stooges and stuff like that, and they're going, wait, not everyone struggles with this type of physical thing. This is supposed to be funny because I grew up with this just being a thing. This is a part of how life works. So that type of comedy can be very strange for these types of people.
And as adults, if your character is an adult who has dealt with this their entire lives, they have likely found a lot of workarounds for really difficult tasks. So they never learned how to use chopsticks, but they have figured out a workaround for the difficulty of navigating a pencil because they had to. So it's not something that they've gotten over, but they have learned to live with, and they have learned different skills and tasks that help them work with it.
Obviously, there are a lot more neurodivergences than just what we're talking about today, but this is already a very long episode, so we're going to cut it off here. There's a lot of food for thought in what we talked about today, and I think there was something relatable with every single one of these things that we went through. The bad handwriting, the tendency to word vomit on something that you're excited about, the tendency to avoid things that you're not excited about. These things are part of what make you human and make your characters human. So find the things that you understand, the things that you can wrap your head around, and then
write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.